3 weeks after my husband died, my daughter-in-law tried to prove in court that I had lost my mind. Not because I forgot my name, not because I couldn't take care of myself, but because if the judge believed her, she would gain control of everything my husband and I had built over 40 years. The house, the savings, the land, all of it. My name is Margaret Stone. I'm 64 years old, and until recently I believed something very simple about my life. I believed my family loved me. I believed the people sitting at my dinner table every Sunday were the same people who would protect me if anything ever went wrong. I was wrong. But before I tell you how my daughter-in-law Jane nearly took everything from me, there's something you need to understand. Because plans like hers don't start in a courtroom. They start much earlier. They start quietly, in the small moments most people ignore. And mine started on a rainy Tuesday morning, the day I buried my husband. The church was almost empty by the time I stepped outside. Most of the guests had already gone home. The flowers inside were beginning to wilt, their sweet scent mixing with the damp smell of rain drifting in through the open doors. Funerals have a strange way of making time feel slow. The day had felt endless. Handshakes, quiet condolences, people telling me how sorry they were for my loss. My husband, Robert Stone, had been a respected man in our town. For 42 years, he ran a small construction company that slowly grew into something successful. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase attention. But people trusted him. And trust, as he always said, was worth more than money. Standing beside his grave that morning, watching the last shovelfuls of dirt fall onto the casket, I remember thinking something very simple. I had just lost the best man I would ever know. Robert and I met when I was 21 years old. I was working the morning shift at a diner just outside town. The kind of place where the coffee is always hot and the regulars sit in the same booth every day. Robert was one of those regulars. For weeks he barely said a word. Just black coffee, toast, and a quiet thank you when I refilled his cup. Then one morning he looked up and asked me a question. "Do you ever take a day off?" That was the beginning of everything. One coffee turned into a conversation. The conversation turned into dinner. And before I realized it, the quiet man from booth number 3 had become the center of my entire life. We didn't start with much. Robert worked construction, long hours, rough hands, the kind of work that leaves dust in your hair and exhaustion in your bones. But he had a dream. He didn't want to just buy a house. He wanted to build one. I still remember the day he showed me the land he had bought after years of saving. It wasn't impressive. Just a patch of open ground outside town, surrounded by tall grass and a few stubborn oak trees. But Robert stood there looking at that empty field like it was the most beautiful place on earth. "This," he said, pointing toward the horizon, "is where our life is going to happen." And he meant every word. For the next 2 years, he built that house with his own hands. After work each evening, he drove out to the land and worked until the sun disappeared behind the hills. I used to bring him sandwiches and lemonade while he hammered boards under the glow of a single work light. Sometimes I would sit on an old folding chair and watch him measure wood again and again, making sure every wall was straight. One night, I asked him something that had been on my mind for weeks. "Why are you working so hard?" I said. "We could just buy a house like everyone else." Robert wiped the sweat from his forehead and smiled. "Because this one," he said, tapping the wooden frame beside him, "will be ours. Every wall will have a story." And he was right. That house became the center of our entire life. We raised our son there. We celebrated birthdays there. We argued, laughed, struggled, and slowly built something that felt permanent. By the time Robert passed away, the house had been standing for 40 years. Every floorboard held a memory. Every window looked out over land we had worked hard to keep. To me, it wasn't just property. It was the story of our life together. But to someone else, it was an opportunity. After the funeral, the rain began to fall harder. I remember standing near the cemetery gate while people slowly drifted away toward their cars. That's when Jane walked over to me. My daughter-in-law had always been composed, elegant, the kind of woman who seemed perfectly put together no matter the situation. Even at my husband's funeral, Her hair looked flawless, and her black coat probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Margaret," she said softly, "you shouldn't be alone tonight." It sounded thoughtful, caring. At the time, I was grateful. Grief has a way of making you hold tightly to anyone offering comfort. So when she suggested that she and my son stay with me for a few days, I agreed. What I didn't realize then was that Jane wasn't staying to help. She was staying to observe. Because while I was mourning my husband, she was studying the house, the documents, the accounts, everything Robert and I had spent a lifetime building. And 3 weeks later, she would walk into a lawyer's office with a set of papers claiming something I had never imagined hearing about myself, that I was mentally unfit to manage my own life. But the most shocking part wasn't the accusation. It was the fact that she thought no one would question it. That evening, after the funeral, the house felt painfully quiet. For 42 years, Robert had filled every corner of that place with life. The sound of his boots by the door, the creak of his chair in the living room, the soft whistle he made every morning while pouring coffee. Now the silence felt heavy. I stood in the kitchen staring at the sink full of dishes people had brought over after the service. Casseroles, pies, covered trays wrapped in foil. Kind gestures from neighbors who didn't know what else to do for a grieving widow. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 7:18 p.m. That's when the front door opened. My son Daniel stepped inside first, shaking rain from his coat. Behind him came Jane, carrying a small overnight bag. "Mom," Daniel said gently, giving me a quick hug. "You shouldn't be alone tonight." Jane gave me a sympathetic smile. "We'll stay for a few days," she added, "just until things settle down." At the time, it felt comforting. Grief makes you grateful for small kindnesses. Having family nearby felt like a relief. So I nodded. "Thank you," I said quietly. Looking back now, that was the moment everything began. The first 2 days were calm. Daniel handled phone calls from relatives and helped organize Robert's paperwork from the funeral home. Jane offered to cook dinner and kept the house tidy. She was attentive, helpful, almost too helpful. I didn't notice it at first, but Jane had a habit of asking very specific questions. Questions that didn't seem strange until later. One morning while we were having coffee at the kitchen table, she glanced around the room slowly. "This house is beautiful," she said. "Did Robert leave everything organized? Accounts, investments, things like that?" I assumed she was just making conversation. "Robert kept records for everything," I replied. "He was very careful with finances." Jane nodded thoughtfully. "Do you know where he kept those records?" I pointed toward the hallway. "His office, second door on the left." She smiled politely, but something about that smile lingered just a second too long. Over the next few days, I noticed Jane wandering through the house more often. At first, I thought she was simply trying to stay busy. Grief affects everyone differently, but sometimes I would walk into a room and find her quietly studying things. The framed deed to the property in the hallway, the filing cabinets in Robert's office, the safe in the corner of the study. Once, I even found her holding one of Robert's financial binders. "Oh," she said quickly when she saw me. "I was just trying to help organize." I thanked her, but a small, uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. Robert had always been extremely private about financial matters. Those binders contained decades of information, bank accounts, property records, investments, things he never discussed casually. 3 days after the funeral, Jane brought up the subject again. We were sitting in the living room when she suddenly leaned forward. "Margaret," she said gently, "have you thought about getting help managing everything?" I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said carefully, "Robert handled most of the financial decisions, right? And this house, the property, the taxes, that's a lot for one person." Her tone was soft, concerned, but something about the way she said it made me uneasy. "I've managed just fine before Robert and I married," I replied calmly. Jane smiled again. "Yes, of course. I just mean, it might be easier if someone helped oversee things." Daniel, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke. "Jane's right, Mom. You shouldn't have to deal with all that stress." I looked at my son. For a moment, something felt different in the room. Subtle, but unmistakable. It was the first time I realized that the two of them had already talked about this. Without me. And that conversation was only the beginning. Because less than 2 weeks later, Jane would place a stack of papers in front of me and say something that still makes my stomach turn when I remember it. "Margaret," she said sweetly, "this is just a simple form, a power of attorney, so we can help take care of things for you." Jane slid the papers across the coffee table like it was the most normal thing in the world. The afternoon sunlight from the living room window fell across the pages, making the black text look sharper somehow, more serious. I stared down at the top sheet. At first glance, it looked official, legal language, paragraphs of small print, a place for signatures at the bottom. Jane leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "It's really nothing complicated," she said with a reassuring smile. "Just a standard power of attorney." Daniel nodded beside her. "Yeah, Mom. It just means we can help handle things for you if you ever need it. If you ever need it." That was the phrase she kept repeating. Jane reached forward and tapped the first page with her finger. "You've been through so much these past few weeks," she continued gently. "The funeral, the paperwork, the bank accounts. It's overwhelming." Her voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone people use when they're trying to sound reasonable. "This way," she said, "Daniel and I could help take care of the complicated stuff." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I picked up the document and began reading. Robert had taught me something important during our marriage. Never sign anything you haven't read, not even if it comes from family. The first paragraph looked harmless enough, legal wording about granting authority for financial management. But as my eyes moved further down the page, something about it made my chest tighten. The language wasn't temporary. It wasn't conditional. It gave broad authority over my finances, my property, even my medical decisions. I glanced up at Jane. "This says you would have control over my bank accounts." Jane didn't hesitate. "Well, technically yes," she said quickly, "but only so we can help you manage things." Daniel added, "Mom, it's just a safety measure." Safety measure. That phrase sounded strangely rehearsed. I flipped to the second page. There were additional clauses there about property management, investment decisions, and something else that made my stomach twist slightly. The document allowed the appointed person, Jane, to act without needing my direct approval in certain situations. "Why is your name listed as the primary agent?" I asked quietly. For the first time, Jane's smile tightened. "Well," she said, "Daniel works long hours. I'm the one with the flexible schedule." Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. "It just makes things easier," he said. I looked back down at the papers again. The room felt strangely quiet. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Jane picked up a pen from the table and placed it beside the document. "If you sign here," she said softly, "everything will be much simpler." For a moment, no one spoke. Something deep in my instincts was beginning to stir. An uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite explain yet. Jane must have sensed my hesitation. Her voice became even softer. "Margaret," she said gently, "you're 64. Managing a large property and multiple accounts can be stressful." She tilted her head slightly. "And Robert handled most of that before, didn't he?" There was something in the way she said it. Something subtle. Something almost testing. As if she were waiting to see whether I would question her. I slowly placed the document back on the table. I think," I said calmly, "I'd like to have a lawyer look at this first." The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. Jane's smile disappeared for half a second before she quickly forced it back. "Oh, Margaret," she said lightly, "that really isn't necessary." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, Mom. It's just a form." But by then, that uneasy feeling in my chest had grown stronger. And something told me this wasn't just about helping me with paperwork. Because the way Jane was watching me wasn't the way someone looks at family. It was the way someone looks at a problem that hasn't been solved yet. Jane didn't argue with me right away, but the atmosphere in the room changed the moment I mentioned a lawyer. It was subtle, the kind of shift you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Jane's smile stayed on her face, but it looked tighter now, less natural. "Oh, Margaret," she said lightly, waving her hand as if the idea was unnecessary. "Lawyers will only complicate things. This is just a simple form." Daniel nodded beside her. "Yeah, Mom. It's not a big deal." But the way he said it felt strangely rushed, as if they were both hoping I would just sign the papers before thinking too much about them. I folded the document closed and placed it neatly back on the coffee table. "I'm sure it's simple," I said calmly. "But Robert always had our attorney review anything like this." Jane leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, we're family," she said. There it was again. That word. Family. The way she used it sounded less like comfort and more like pressure. I stood up slowly from the chair. "I'll think about it," I said. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Jane forced another polite smile. "Of course," she said, but something in her eyes had changed. The warmth was gone, and in its place was something colder, something calculating. Over the next few days, Jane didn't bring up the papers again. Not directly, but I began noticing small things that made me uneasy. Little comments, little questions. One afternoon she walked into the kitchen while I was making tea. "Margaret," she said casually, leaning against the counter. "Have you been sleeping all right lately?" I glanced at her. "Yes, why?" She shrugged. "Oh, I just noticed you seemed a little forgetful yesterday." Forgetful. The word caught my attention immediately. "I was tired," I replied. Jane nodded sympathetically. "Of course, grief can do that." She said it kindly, but something about the way she watched my reaction made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. A few days later, something else happened. I was in Robert's office organizing some old papers when I overheard Jane speaking quietly in the hallway. Her voice was low, but the house was quiet enough that I could hear pieces of the conversation. "She's still resisting," Jane whispered. A pause. Then she continued. "No, I don't think she realizes yet." My hands froze over the stack of documents on the desk. Who was she talking to? I stepped closer to the door. Jane's voice dropped even lower. "If we can establish that she's struggling mentally, the process becomes much easier." My heart skipped. Struggling mentally? The floorboard beneath my foot creaked. Jane stopped speaking immediately. A moment later she appeared in the doorway. "Oh," she said lightly. "I didn't realize you were in here." Her expression was calm again, perfectly composed. But my instincts were screaming now. "What process?" I asked quietly. Jane blinked. "What do you mean?" "You said something about establishing that I'm struggling mentally." For a split second, she hesitated. Then the smile returned. "Oh, Margaret," she laughed softly. "You must have misunderstood. I was talking about my mother." Her answer came too quickly, too smoothly, and suddenly I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Jane wasn't just trying to convince me to sign a document. She was building a narrative, one where I was confused, forgetful, maybe even unstable. And if she could make other people believe that, those papers on the coffee table wouldn't even be necessary. Because in the right courtroom, a judge could give her control of everything without my permission at all. But what Jane didn't know yet was that someone else had just entered the story. Someone who would see through her plan almost immediately. His name was Peter, and the day he knocked on my front door, everything began to change. The knock on my front door came on a quiet Thursday afternoon. At first, I almost didn't answer it. Since Robert passed away, the house had been unusually busy. Neighbors bringing food, distant relatives stopping by with sympathy cards, people offering help I didn't really need. But that day, the house was quiet again. Daniel had gone back to work, and Jane had driven into town earlier that morning. She said she needed to run a few errands. So when the knock came again, 3 slow, steady taps, I walked down the hallway and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. Margaret Stone, he said warmly, removing his hat. For a moment my mind struggled to place him. Then recognition hit. Peter, I said. He smiled. Still remember me? Of course I remembered him. Peter Lawson had been a close friend of Robert's years ago. They met when Robert first started expanding his construction business. Peter worked in legal administration at a local law firm back then, helping small companies handle contracts and paperwork. He had always been the careful one, the man who read every document twice before signing anything. "What are you doing here?" I asked, surprised. Peter shifted slightly on the porch. "I heard about Robert," he said gently. "I'm sorry, Margaret. He was a good man." I nodded quietly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Peter gestured toward the house. "Mind if I come in for a few minutes?" We sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. The same table where Robert used to read the newspaper every morning. Peter looked around the room slowly, taking in the familiar space. "This place hasn't changed much," he said. "Robert liked things the way they were," I replied. Peter nodded. "That sounds like him." For a few minutes we talked about Robert, old stories, business projects, the early years when everything felt uncertain. But eventually, Peter leaned back slightly and studied my face. "You look tired," he said. "Grief has a way of making honesty easier." "I am," I admitted. Then something made me add, almost without thinking, "And things here have been complicated." Peter raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to sound paranoid. Jane had been polite, helpful, at least on the surface. But another part of me, the part that had been growing uneasy for days, needed someone objective to hear the story. So I told him. I told him about the power of attorney papers, about Jane asking questions about the finances, about the conversation I overheard in the hallway. Peter didn't interrupt once. He simply listened, his fingers folded together on the table. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then he said something very simple. "Do you still have the documents she asked you to sign?" "Yes," I said slowly. "They're in the living room." Peter stood up immediately. "Margaret," he said calmly, "I'd like to take a look at them." The papers were still sitting on the coffee table where Jane had left them. Peter picked up the stack and began reading. At first, his expression remained neutral. But as he turned the pages, his jaw tightened slightly. By the time he reached the last sheet, he exhaled slowly. Then he looked up at me. "Margaret," he said carefully, "did you sign any of this?" "No." "Good," he replied immediately. He placed the papers back on the table. Then he said a sentence that made the room feel suddenly colder. "These documents aren't just about helping you manage finances." He tapped the second page with his finger. "If you sign this, your daughter-in-law gains complete authority over your property, your accounts, and several of your legal rights." My stomach tightened. "But that's not even the worst part." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" Peter turned the page again and pointed to a section buried in the legal text. "This clause allows the agent to declare that you are mentally incapable of managing your own affairs if certain conditions are met." My heart began beating faster. "That's ridiculous," I said. Peter looked at me seriously. "Yes," he said, "but if someone wanted to make that claim, this document would make it much easier." He leaned back slowly in the chair. Then he said the words that confirmed the fear growing in my chest. "Margaret, this isn't just paperwork." He looked down at the papers again. "This looks like the first step in a plan." Peter didn't say anything for a long moment after that. He just sat there, looking down at the documents, his fingers resting on the edge of the table. The house felt unusually quiet. Outside, a light breeze moved through the oak trees Robert had planted years ago. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves through the living room window. Finally, Peter looked up again. "Margaret," he said carefully, "has Jane asked you to sign these more than once?" I nodded. "She brought them up 3 days ago." When I hesitated, she said it was just a safety measure. Peter gave a small, humorless smile. "That's exactly how people introduce documents like this. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten even more. Why? I asked quietly. Peter leaned back in his chair. Because once someone signs a power of attorney like this, the person receiving the authority can do almost anything in their name. He tapped the paper again. Sell property. Transfer money. Make legal decisions. My hands felt suddenly cold. But you said there was something worse, I reminded him. Peter nodded slowly. Yes. He flipped back to the middle of the document and pointed to a paragraph buried deep in the legal text. See this section? I leaned closer. The language was dense, full of legal phrases that were easy to overlook. This clause allows the agent to begin a competency review, Peter explained. What does that mean? I asked. It means they can request that a doctor or court evaluate whether you are mentally capable of managing your own affairs. My chest tightened. And if the evaluation says I'm not? Peter's voice stayed calm. Then a court can appoint a guardian. Usually the person already listed in documents like this. I didn't need to ask who that person would be. Jane. The realization made the room feel smaller somehow. But I never agreed to anything like that, I said. Peter nodded. That's why these documents exist. He folded his hands together. Because if someone can convince others that you're forgetful, confused, or unstable, his voice trailed off. They can make the argument that they're only trying to protect you. The word protect sounded strange in that moment. Cold. Calculated. I stared at the papers again. So you think Jane is trying to prove I'm mentally unfit? Peter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question. Have you noticed her saying things about your memory? My mind went back over the past week. Jane asking if I'd been sleeping well. Jane mentioning that I seemed forgetful. Jane speaking quietly on the phone about establishing that I was struggling mentally. My stomach sank. Yes, I said slowly. Peter nodded once. That's how these situations usually begin. A long silence settled over the room. Then Peter stood up and walked toward the window. Margaret, he said after a moment. How much does Jane know about Robert's estate? Not everything, I replied. But she knows the house is paid off. And that Robert had investments. Peter turned back toward me. And your son? Daniel knows about most of it. Peter exhaled slowly. That's a significant amount of money. I didn't answer, because we both knew it was true. Robert had spent 42 years building his company, carefully saving, carefully investing. He always said the same thing whenever we talked about the future. This is for security, he would say. So neither of us ever has to worry. Peter walked back to the table and placed his hand on the documents. Margaret, he said quietly. If Jane is serious about this plan, he paused. Then she won't stop just because you refuse to sign these. A chill moved through me. What do you mean? Peter looked directly at me. I mean she may already be preparing another way. And the way he said it made one terrible possibility suddenly feel very real. Jane didn't actually need my signature. All she needed was for other people to believe I wasn't capable of making decisions anymore. Peter closed the folder and slid the papers back across the coffee table. For a moment neither of us spoke. The weight of what he had just explained hung in the room like heavy air before a storm. Finally, I broke the silence. So what do I do? Peter didn't hesitate. You don't confront her. That surprised me. You mean, pretend I don't know? He nodded. Exactly. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if Jane might somehow hear us from across town. If Jane really is building a case to claim you're mentally unfit, then she's already collecting evidence. What kind of evidence? I asked. Small things, Peter said. Conversations, observations, statements from people who might say you seem confused or forgetful. The words made my stomach twist. Then we should stop her, I said. Peter shook his head calmly. No, what we should do is watch her. He tapped the stack of documents again. People who run plans like this always think they're smarter than everyone else. That confidence makes them careless. And when they get careless, he added quietly, they leave proof. That afternoon we spent nearly 2 hours going through Robert's office. Peter moved slowly, carefully, the way someone trained to notice details examines a scene. He opened filing cabinets, checked financial binders, reviewed account records. Robert had always been meticulous with paperwork, and Peter seemed almost impressed. "He kept everything organized," Peter said. "That was Robert," I replied. Peter nodded. "That may end up protecting you." When we finished, Peter closed the final binder and looked at me seriously. "Margaret, there's something important you need to do." "What?" "Start writing things down." "Writing what down?" "Everything." He began listing them off on his fingers. "Every conversation you have with Jane. Every comment she makes about your memory. Every document she asks you to sign." I frowned. "You think this could go to court?" Peter met my eyes. "If she's trying to establish legal control over your finances, then yes." The word hung heavily between us. Court. I had spent my entire life avoiding legal trouble. And now, suddenly, I might be standing in front of a judge defending my own sanity. Just as Peter was gathering his coat, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. "Jane." Peter glanced toward the window. "That must be her." My pulse quickened. "What do I do?" Peter's expression remained calm. "You act normal. And the papers? Leave them exactly where they are." He lowered his voice again. "If Jane believes you're still considering signing them, she'll keep pushing. And when she pushes," he said quietly, "we learn more about her plan." The front door opened. Jane's voice echoed down the hallway. "Margaret? I'm back." Peter gave me a small nod. "Remember," he said under his breath, "let her think she's winning." Jane stepped into the living room a second later. She stopped when she saw Peter. "Oh," she said politely, though surprise flashed across her face. "I didn't realize we had company." I stood up. "Jane, this is Peter Lawson, an old friend of Robert's." Peter extended his hand calmly. "Nice to meet you." Jane shook it, but her eyes quickly moved to the coffee table, to the documents. For a split second, her expression changed. A flash of irritation. Then the smile returned. "Well," she said lightly, "I hope Margaret hasn't been bothering you with boring paperwork." Peter smiled pleasantly. "Not at all." He glanced down at the papers. "In fact, we were just discussing them." And in that moment, I saw something in Jane's eyes. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. Because for the first time since Robert died, someone else in the room understood exactly what she was trying to do. Jane's smile stayed in place. But it had changed. It was still polite. Still controlled. But there was a tension behind it now, like someone trying very hard to remain calm while recalculating a situation. She stepped further into the room and set her purse on the side table. "So," she said lightly, glancing between Peter and me, "what exactly were you discussing?" Peter answered before I could. "The documents on the table." Jane's eyes flicked toward them again, just for a second. Then she laughed softly. "Oh, those," she said. "They're nothing important. Just something Daniel and I thought might help Margaret manage things." Peter nodded slowly, as if considering her explanation. "That's thoughtful." Jane tilted her head slightly. "Yes, Margaret has been under a lot of stress lately." There it was again. The same subtle phrase. Stress. Jane walked over to the coffee table and gently gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I know paperwork can feel overwhelming," she continued, her voice calm and sympathetic, "especially after losing someone." She looked at me. "But the goal here is simply to make things easier for you." Peter folded his hands loosely. "I understand," he said. Then he added something that made the air in the room tighten slightly. "I used to work in legal administration." Jane froze for a fraction of a second. It was quick. So quick most people might have missed it. But I saw it. Peter continued calmly. "So I'm always curious about documents like these." Jane recovered quickly. "That's good," she said with a small smile. "Then you probably know they're perfectly standard." Peter reached for the top page again. Standard documents usually don't include clauses allowing an agent to initiate competency reviews. Jane's hand stopped halfway to the papers. The room fell silent. For the first time since she walked in, Jane didn't have an immediate answer. Her eyes moved between Peter and the document. Then she let out a small breath and forced another smile. "Well," she said lightly, "legal language can be complicated." Peter nodded. "That's true." He tapped the paragraph again. "But this clause is very specific." Jane's voice sharpened slightly. "Are you suggesting there's something wrong with it?" Peter shook his head calmly. "I'm suggesting Margaret should have her own attorney review anything like this." Jane's eyes moved slowly toward me. The warmth in her expression was gone now. Completely. "Margaret," she said carefully, "do you really think that's necessary?" Her tone was still soft, but the pressure underneath it was unmistakable. Before I could answer, Peter spoke again. "It's always necessary." Jane looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled again. But this time, the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said. She placed the papers back on the table and picked up her purse again. "I only wanted to help." Her voice sounded perfectly reasonable, perfectly calm. But as she turned toward the hallway, I noticed something strange. Jane wasn't upset. She wasn't embarrassed. If anything, she looked thoughtful, as if she had just discovered a new complication in her plan, and she was already figuring out how to work around it. Peter waited until her footsteps disappeared upstairs. Then he leaned closer to me and spoke quietly. "She's not surprised." "What do you mean?" I whispered. Peter glanced toward the staircase. "Someone who just had their plan exposed would usually panic." He paused. Jane didn't. A chill ran down my spine. "What does that mean?" Peter's voice was calm, but serious. "It means this document was probably only one part of her plan. And if she's already prepared the next step." He looked toward the hallway where Jane had disappeared. "Then things are about to move much faster." Jane didn't come back downstairs for almost an hour. During that time, Peter and I stayed in the living room, speaking quietly. Neither of us said much, but the silence felt different now. Heavier, more alert. Peter sat back in the armchair, watching the staircase like someone waiting for the next move in a chess match. Finally, he spoke. "Margaret, there's something else we should consider." "What?" I asked. "If Jane is preparing to claim you're mentally unfit, she'll need more than just paperwork." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "She'll need witnesses." The word sent a cold wave through me. "Witnesses?" Peter nodded. "Doctors, neighbors, family members. Anyone who could testify that you've seemed confused, forgetful, or unstable." My mind immediately jumped to the small comments Jane had been making over the past week. "You seemed forgetful yesterday. Have you been sleeping all right?" Grief can affect memory. Suddenly those conversations didn't feel innocent anymore. They felt like setup. "But that's ridiculous," I said. "I'm perfectly fine." Peter gave a small nod. "I know that." Then he leaned forward slightly. "But courts don't just rely on truth. They rely on evidence." Before I could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. "Jane." She descended slowly, her expression calm again. Too calm. When she reached the bottom step, she looked directly at me. "Margaret," she said gently, "Daniel and I have been talking." Peter's eyes flicked toward her, but he didn't say anything. Jane continued. "We're a little concerned about you." There it was. The sentence hung in the room like a warning. "Concerned," I repeated. Jane nodded sympathetically. "You've been through a terrible loss." She walked into the room slowly, speaking carefully. "Grief affects people in different ways." Peter crossed one leg over the other, watching her closely. Jane stopped near the coffee table. "I spoke with Daniel earlier," she continued, "and he mentioned you've seemed a little distracted lately." Distracted. Another carefully chosen word. I felt my chest tighten. "I'm grieving," I said calmly. "Of course," Jane replied quickly. "That's exactly why we're worried." Peter finally spoke. "Worried about what, exactly?" Jane turned toward him. Well, Margaret has been forgetting things recently. I stared at her. That's not true. Jane didn't look at me. Instead, she kept speaking calmly. Yesterday, she misplaced Robert's financial binder. I moved it into the office, I said sharply. Jane smiled gently. See, the way she said it made my stomach twist. It sounded like proof, like confirmation of something she had already decided was true. Peter leaned forward slightly. Jane, he said calmly. Grief doesn't equal incompetence. Jane's eyes hardened for a split second. I never said it did. Then she turned back to me. But Margaret, maybe it would help if you spoke with someone. What do you mean? I asked. A doctor. The word hit the room like a dropped glass. Jane continued smoothly. Just to make sure you're handling everything all right. Peter's expression didn't change, but his voice became very quiet. And if the doctor says she isn't? Jane didn't hesitate. Then Daniel and I will make sure she's protected. Protected. The same word Peter had warned me about. But now I understood what it really meant. Jane wasn't asking me to sign papers anymore. She was preparing to prove to other people that I wasn't capable of saying no. For a moment, no one spoke. The room had gone completely still. Jane stood beside the coffee table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching me with that same calm expression she had perfected over the past few weeks. But now I understood something I hadn't fully realized before. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a step in her plan. If I agreed to see a doctor she recommended, she could control the narrative. If I refused, she could tell everyone I was being irrational. Either way, she would claim I was unstable. Peter broke the silence first. That sounds unnecessary, he said calmly. Jane turned toward him. I disagree, she replied. Her voice stayed polite, but there was steel behind it now. Margaret has been under a lot of emotional strain. Peter leaned forward slightly. Grief isn't a medical condition. Jane gave him a thin smile. No, she said, but it can cause confusion. Then she looked back at me. Margaret, this doesn't have to be difficult. The way she said it made my stomach tighten, because suddenly the tone of the conversation had changed. This wasn't family concern anymore. It was pressure. I'm not confused, I said quietly. Jane nodded sympathetically, as if I had just proven her point. Of course you don't feel that way. Peter's eyes narrowed slightly. Jane, he said calmly. You're speaking about Margaret as if she's not capable of making her own decisions. Jane shrugged lightly. I'm speaking as someone who cares about her well-being. Then she reached into her purse. When she pulled her hand back out, she was holding something. A business card. She placed it gently on the coffee table. This is Dr. Collins, she said. He specializes in cognitive evaluations. Peter didn't touch the card. Neither did I. Jane continued speaking in that same careful voice. He could perform a simple assessment. Just a few questions, a short examination. She paused. And if everything is fine, then there's nothing to worry about. It sounded reasonable. That was the frightening part, because anyone listening from the outside would probably think the same thing. But Peter spoke before I could respond. And if the evaluation doesn't say everything is fine? Jane met his eyes directly. Then Daniel and I will make sure Margaret gets the help she needs. The help she needs. The phrase hung heavily in the room. Peter leaned back slowly. You mean legal guardianship? Jane didn't answer immediately, but the silence was answer enough. A cold wave moved through my chest. This was happening much faster than I expected. Peter had been right. Jane wasn't abandoning her plan. She was accelerating it. Then Jane did something that made everything even clearer. She picked up the stack of documents again. This doesn't have to go that far, she said softly. She slid the papers back toward me. If you sign the power of attorney now, none of this becomes necessary. There it was. The real goal. The doctor. The concerns. The conversations about my memory. It had all been building toward this moment. I looked down at the papers. Then I looked at Jane. For the first time since Robert died, I saw her clearly. Not as my son's wife, not as family, but as someone who believed she had already won. Peter's voice broke the silence. "Margaret," he said calmly, "don't sign anything today." Jane's smile disappeared, and for the first time, a flash of real irritation crossed her face, because the situation was no longer unfolding the way she expected. But what Jane didn't realize yet was that Peter had already begun preparing something of his own, something that could turn her entire plan against her. Jane's irritation disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Within a second, the polite smile returned to her face. But now that I knew what to look for, I could see the difference. The warmth was gone. What remained was calculation. She picked up the pen from the table again and gently tapped it beside the documents. "Margaret," she said softly, "there's really no reason to make this complicated." Peter remained perfectly still in his chair. Jane continued, "You're grieving. That's understandable." Her tone sounded sympathetic again. "But Daniel and I only want to make sure everything is handled properly." She slid the papers slightly closer to me. "If you sign this now, we can avoid unnecessary stress." The word stress hung in the air like a warning. I didn't move. Peter finally spoke. "Jane," he said calmly, "you seem very eager for Margaret to sign those documents today." Jane turned toward him slowly. "I'm eager for Margaret to have support," she replied. Peter nodded. "That's admirable." Then he leaned forward and picked up the first page again. "But something about this document bothers me." Jane crossed her arms slightly. "And what would that be?" Peter looked down at the second page. "The agent listed here." Jane's voice hardened. "You already asked about that." Peter looked up. "Yes, and the answer still doesn't make sense." Jane's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you implying?" Peter placed the paper back on the table. "I'm implying that if someone wanted to gain control of Margaret's assets quickly, this would be one way to start." The room fell silent. Jane let out a small, dismissive laugh. "That's absurd." Peter shrugged lightly. "Maybe." Then he reached into his jacket pocket. When he pulled his hand back out, he was holding his phone. Jane's expression shifted again. "What are you doing?" she asked. Peter calmly placed the phone on the table. "Recording this conversation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. Jane stared at the phone. "You can't just record people without permission," she said sharply. Peter raised an eyebrow. "Actually, in this state, I can." Jane's jaw tightened. Peter's voice remained calm. "I thought it might be useful to document today's conversation." He glanced toward the papers. "And the pressure being placed on Margaret to sign legal documents." Jane's face flushed slightly. "I'm not pressuring anyone." Peter nodded. "Good." He leaned back again. "Then you won't mind if Margaret has her own attorney review these first." Jane looked at me, then at the papers, then back at Peter. For the first time since this entire situation began, she looked uncertain, because the power dynamic in the room had shifted. She had expected a grieving widow, a confused older woman she could guide toward signing a few convenient documents. What she hadn't expected was a witness, someone who understood exactly what those papers meant, and someone who was now quietly collecting evidence. Jane picked up her purse again. "This conversation has become ridiculous," she said coldly. She turned toward the hallway. "Daniel will want to hear about this." Then she stopped near the doorway and looked back at me. One last time. "Margaret," she said softly, "I hope you understand that we're only trying to help." The words sounded kind, but the look in her eyes said something very different. Because Jane was already thinking about her next move. And something told me she wasn't finished yet. Jane didn't wait long to make her next move. The following morning, Daniel arrived at the house earlier than usual. I heard his truck pull into the driveway just after 8. The engine shut off, and a moment later the front door opened. His footsteps were heavier than normal. Angry, Jane followed him into the living room a few seconds later, her expression calm but alert. "Mom," Daniel said immediately. "Jane told me what happened yesterday." I set my coffee cup down on the table. "What exactly did she tell you?" That you brought some stranger into the house to accuse her of trying to steal from you. Peter, who had returned that morning as we had quietly planned, stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. "My name is Peter Lawson," he said calmly. "I'm not a stranger." Daniel looked at him sharply. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" "An old friend of your father's," Peter replied. Jane folded her arms. "Daniel, this is exactly what I was telling you about," she said softly. "Margaret has been listening to people who are confusing her. Confusing me." The phrase sounded so casual, so carefully chosen. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, we're just trying to help you." I looked at my son for a long moment. "Are you?" Before he could answer, Peter placed something on the table. Folder. Jane's eyes immediately dropped to it. "What's that?" she asked. Peter opened the folder slowly. Documentation. He slid several printed pages across the table. "These are copies of the documents Jane asked Margaret to sign." Daniel glanced at them. "So?" Peter turned another page. "And these," he continued, "are notes from our conversation yesterday." Jane's face tightened. Peter tapped the top sheet. "I've also sent copies of these documents to Margaret's attorney." Daniel looked confused. "Why would you do that?" Peter's voice stayed calm. "Because the clauses in this power of attorney raise serious legal concerns." Jane laughed sharply. "That's ridiculous." Peter met her eyes. "Is it?" Then he turned the page again. "And the attorney also reviewed something else." Jane's smile vanished. "What are you talking about?" Peter slid the final document forward. "A draft petition for guardianship." The room went silent. Daniel stared at the page. "What is this?" Jane didn't answer. Peter spoke instead. "This is the paperwork someone would file with the court to declare Margaret mentally unfit." Daniel slowly turned toward Jane. "Jane?" She finally spoke. "It's just a precaution." But now her voice wasn't calm anymore. Daniel looked back at the document. "And you were already preparing this?" Jane hesitated. And in that moment, everything changed. Because Daniel finally understood what had been happening. He pushed the papers away from him. "You told me this was just about helping Mom with paperwork." Jane's composure cracked. "I was trying to protect our future." The words came out sharper than she intended. Daniel stared at her. "Our future." Peter quietly closed the folder. "Margaret's attorney has already filed a report regarding these documents," he said calmly. Jane's eyes widened. "With who?" Peter met her gaze. "With the State Bar Association and financial fraud investigators." The color drained from her face. Because now the plan she had spent weeks building had turned into evidence. Jane grabbed her purse. "This is insane," she snapped. She turned toward the door, but Daniel didn't follow. Instead, he remained standing beside the table, staring at the documents. For the first time, he looked at me, really looked, and what he saw was not a confused old woman, just his mother, the woman who had raised him. Jane left the house 10 minutes later. The investigation that followed took months. In the end, the authorities determined that the documents she prepared showed clear intent to manipulate legal control over my estate. Jane was charged with fraud and barred from handling financial matters in the case. Daniel and I didn't speak much during that time. Betrayal leaves deep cracks. But slowly, things began to heal. As for me, I updated every legal document Robert and I had ever created. And this time, I made sure the right people were watching. Because if Robert taught me anything during those 42 years together, it was this: trust is powerful, but protecting yourself is even more important.